Namaste. I'm
Namaste.
absolutely delighted to do this interview with Professor Jeffrey Long, one of the most renowned experts on Hinduism around the world. He's written many wonderful texts on Hinduism. One of my favorite, and let me hold it up, this beautiful book called Hinduism in America, A Convergence of Worlds, which I greatly enjoyed, which I received during the COVID period. And it really helped me understand what Hinduism meant in a country like America. I knew a little bit about it, like, for instance, Swami Vivekananda going to America and others like Srila Prabhupada. But I think Professor Long's book really gave me deep context from an American point of view, because indeed, Professor Long is American. Thank you very much, Professor Long, for joining this conversation and having this conversation with me.
Well, thank you for your very kind and warm welcome.
I want to begin by asking you, and there's a beautiful, beautiful image of Sri Ramakrishna behind you. Really, one of the great sages of the open-mindedness of Hinduism, so to speak. But today we are talking, Professor Long, about Hinduphobia, and I want to begin by referring to a tweet that you put out a few days ago, where you said, you spoke about your own personal lived experience. And you said, let no one tell you that Hinduphobia is not real. Could we please begin there? Could you tell us what happened and why you put out this tweet?
Yes. Okay. Well, thank you for this opportunity to elaborate on that, because Twitter, it's not my favorite medium. Everything is very brief, and I think things generally need more explanation. So thank you for that opportunity. I've had this experience periodically throughout my life as I've been drawn to the practice of Hinduism, as I've become a devotee of Sri Ramakrishna and following in the path of Sri Ramakrishna and Swami Vivekananda. And I identify myself as Hindu. I actually formally joined the tradition. I received an initiation into the tradition back in 1995. So I've been practicing for some time, and this would just be my own private matter, but for the fact that I'm also a professor and I write about these things and I talk about these things. So I have had, from time to time, people from the tradition I grew up in, from the Christian tradition, try to, in their words, they want to bring me back, right? They think that I need to convert, that my soul is in danger, and so on. And this has not happened to me for actually quite a long time now, because I think people who know me well enough know that I'm pretty entrenched in what I'm practicing, and they have a hard time arguing with me, I find sometimes. So they don't really try. But recently, someone really did, and it was someone that I knew, actually. It was not out of the blue. It was someone that I had known for some time. And it really came as quite a shock, the intensity with which this person was, I called it harassment in my tweet. I said, I've been harassed since this past Friday by someone. It was really distracting, and it came at a very bad time also, because the semester is beginning. I'm working on my courses, and I'm getting all these messages from this person. And it was hard to ignore, because it was someone I knew, and my initial reaction was concern. That person seemed upset. I wanted to, work with them. And this is, on a scale of harassment, I would have to admit that's fairly minor. I mean, there are people who've been threatened and, death threats and that sort of. This was nothing like that, but it was very irritating. And the person has a very intense aversion to the Hindu tradition. And the reason I tweeted about it, rather than just this being my own private experience, is because there is a discourse right now that is, I would say, it's critiquing certain aspects of politics in India. And I think that kind of critique is just fine. It's not really what I do. I follow politics, but I'm not a political person. But part of that discourse is a denial that there is this thing we call Hinduphobia. Some people don't like the word Hinduphobia. A lot of Hindus don't like the term Hinduphobia. They think, well, it should be called something else. But this is a very old term. It goes back to the colonial period, and it's a very old phenomenon. There have been people writing horrible things about Hindus and Hinduism and trying to convert Hindus to other traditions for a long, long time. And as I researched my book on Hinduism in America, which you just kindly mentioned, in America particularly, that religious bias is also often fused with racism. So it's there is a specifically Hinduphobia. There is, you could say, a broader Indophobia, which would include Hinduphobia, Islamophobia, and even attacks against people like Sikhs, for example, who would even be mistaken for Hindus, because the people who have this kind of bigotry in America often don't even really know that much about the traditions they are hating and rejecting. And so they don't differentiate often between traditions of various communities. But there is phobia and hatred directed specifically against Hindus. And there have been incidents of temples being vandalized. There was an incident in the American South just a year or two ago. People went in and they defaced murtis, and it was very clear what the motive was behind this. This wasn't just random vandalism, because they also spray painted, "Turn to Jesus" or something like that on the wall. So I mean, they were clearly coming from some kind of Christian perspective. I mean, all Christians don't do this, obviously, but they were coming from that perspective that they saw Hinduism as a bad thing. There was a recent incident, not an incident, but an issue in the state of Alabama about the teaching of yoga in schools. And there had long been aversion to this because you'll hear these very strange claims being made, like if you practice yoga and meditation, you'll become possessed by the devil, and you'll become Hindu, and that's very bad. And so, so to deny that, it seems to me, is it's just factually wrong. And for people who've suffered from it and experienced it, and I mean, even my very mild experience with it, nevertheless, shook me up, and it consumed some amount of my time and energy. And for someone to say, "Well, no, that's not real," is we call it gaslighting, right? It's when you try to tell someone that what they're experiencing isn't really true. It's not really there. There's nothing to see here. And of course, if we dig deeper into the history, especially the recent history of India, there have been large-scale attacks against Hindus in places like Bangladesh. I had family members from my wife's family who experienced a lot of this. The Kashmiri Pandit experience, of course. I mean, these are all real things. And my sense is that in the effort to critique a certain political movement, there's maybe an overreach in trying to say that some of the fears and the concerns that movement is based on, or that it talks about and wants to promote awareness of, to deny that those really happened, or that they're not very important. I think that's very problematic. And I think that I've read statements to the effect that also, some of these things have happened to Hindus, but Hindus have also done X, Y, and Z. Well, I don't see that with regard to any other community that I read about, that the community has to be morally perfect in order for attacks against it to be morally objectionable. It's like, oh, well, that terrible thing happened to them, but they do this. So no, terrible things happen to people. We say, "Oh, that's terrible. It's objectionable. It should not occur." And that's why I made the tweet. I just wanted to say, I experienced my own mini version of this over the course of several days. So to say it doesn't exist is just not true. I mean, it's contrary to many, 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 many people's experience,
including, of course, your own experience. Professor Long, I want to take you back a little bit, because there's obviously a history to this, as you mentioned. This is not new. Just before we began this interview, we were talking about written texts that exist, and have been historically documented, of early colonials, or early Europeans, should I say. They were not colonials yet, but early Europeans coming to India, including the Dutch, the Portuguese, and later the English, and so on and so forth, where several travelers, when they encountered, say, Indian devis and Shakti worship and so on and so forth, they equated that with devil worship, with
Yes.
monsters, and so on and so forth. All this is, especially in art history, for instance, all this is very well documented, right?
Oh, yes.
And there seems to be a sort of unbroken tradition in a sense of that, because what begins with monsters, in a sense, ends with misrepresentations that are often critiqued. Like, for instance, one academic saying that Ganesha's, trunk is a phallic symbol, which absolutely no Hindu around the world would ever identify with that kind of representation. So it seems to me, and please correct me if I'm wrong, that when we discuss this topic, we are usually skimming the surface. We are not going deep enough and asking tougher questions.
I think that could often be true. And the scholarly interpretations of Hindu traditions are sort of one thing. I think very often those are conversations that were originally sort of occurring, within a very academic context, and then when they become more publicly available without any added context there, some of these things sound very outrageous, and that they certainly don't reflect the subjectivity of Hindu practitioners at all, right? I mean, that's one of the things that's important to underline about that. But I think when I think of Hinduphobia, I think more of these very overt kinds of, like you were saying, describing, you have, say, 15th century descriptions of Hindu worship as being devil worship and demonic. There's a straight line from that to the year 2021 in the state of Alabama, and people having fears about children being taught yoga and meditation for the same reason, right? It's demonic and evil. And this whole idea that anything that is different or other from one's own belief or practice, that's demonic and evil. This, I think, is really the root problem. And this is something I've been arguing against for a long time. And I mean, it's the antithesis of what Sri Ramakrishna taught, right? That any path that became available to him, he would try it and he would follow it, because he wanted to experience the divine reality in all of its various forms, its various aspects, and so on. And there are traditions in which the very notion of multiple divine forms is just, not allowed, right? That is seen as something that's going to take you astray. And so I think that there is an underlying sub-theme here that the Hindu traditions, and I think I would even add, related traditions like Buddhism and Jainism and so on, in a certain sense, they represent a kind of threat to the dominance of the Western worldview. That in the Western worldview, I mean, broadly speaking, you have two main currents. There is Christianity, and then there is the sort of secular, science-based kind of current. And both of those are challenged in various ways by the epistemology and the worldview of traditions like Hinduism. Something like Vedanta presents a completely alternate understanding of reality that is cohesive. And as I wrote in my book, In Hinduism in America, many Westerners like myself actually find appealing. And so there are people who are threatened by this. And I think that some of this aversion to Hinduism, some of it I think is just kind of a repetition of what people have heard. You grow up being taught a certain way. The way Hindu traditions are represented in American high schools has been abysmal, right? People think of Hinduism, they only think of casteism. They don't think about Vedanta or Brahman or the Upanishads or anything like that. They're thinking of a social system that's been presented to them in a way that's actually very textually based and often doesn't have that much to do with ground realities in India. And so their whole perspective, I mean, on what the Hindu tradition is very distorted, and there's a kind of an instinctive aversion that kind of fuels, so anything you read, anything that's negative, it connects with what you've already been kind of conditioned to think, and it furthers that, I think, in many ways. And of course, at the same time, there is a very broad movement that's started roughly in the 90s of Hindus becoming very assertive and saying, well, we don't like the way we're being represented, and this is not really how we understand ourselves and what we really believe or practice. And a lot has been generated out of this kind of clash, you could say, between Western representation of Hindu traditions and the Hindu response to that. And of course, another issue that we have to be mindful of is we're talking about very broad movements, both among Hindus and among people in the West. So it's not uniform. There are, I know quite a few Western academic scholars of Hinduism who will say, maybe quietly, that some of the criticisms of academic representations of Hinduism by people in the Hindu community are spot on. Yes, those are actually corrections that need to be made. At the same time, unfortunately, because I think the emotions run so deep, and many Hindus feel very deeply hurt by what's happened, sometimes the reaction is not always the most measured, and you get death threats and that sort of thing. So that would make people more hesitant to then, on the sort of academic side, to embrace that, because they might be seen as embracing that kind of violent rhetoric and so on. So the nuance is just gone, right? It's you're with us or against us, and there's been what I've seen is like a hardening on both sides of this kind of divide that makes really intelligent communication almost impossible, because the moment you say anything at all critical about either, I hate to even call them sides, but the assumption is automatically, well, then you must be from the other side. And then all the, resulting outpouring of vitriol happens. So it's reached a really bad state in terms of the ability to sort of calmly talk about all of this. But it's also, complicated by the fact that there are people with agendas, right, that they're trying to advance. And there are people who, let's say, may be critical of the current ruling party in India, but don't have a negative feeling about the Hindu tradition as a whole. And then you have people who, no, they really don't like Hinduism either. And it's very easy to then veil that as a kind of political critique, but really, when you dig underneath it, there's a deeper agenda of that is averse to the whole tradition. And this is all very
one small question here, if I may.
Yes.
Which is you began this answer with the point about practice, and you said we should underline that the practiced experience often does not reflect, right?
Yes.
May I ask you that when the West studies various religious traditions, Sikhism, Buddhism, Islam, and so on and so forth, often we find that in those departments, in that study, those departments and that study is often populated by practitioners. In fact, it would not be wrong to say that often it is led by practitioners. People who have embedded themselves not only in the academic study of the faith, but have also embedded themselves in many ways in the practice. Somehow, this doesn't seem to be true in Hinduism's case, because one sees, you are a rarity, but one sees in many cases, and I'm not saying all cases, there are of course exceptions, but in many cases, people who lead the academic study in Hinduism almost revel and underline the fact that they have nothing to do with the practice. I would like to ask you, why is this an aberration? Because surely some of the problem might begin there.
Yes, and it's a complex series of reasons that this is the case. And for one, when the study of Hinduism and of world religions generally started to become, started to become more prominent in the United States, it was during the period of the Asian Exclusion Act, when there weren't that many Indian scholars in the United States. And then the other thing that I think has played a role, and it's been more prominent with the study of Hindu traditions than with many other traditions, is that it's been very heavily textual, very, very text driven. It's been the study mostly of Sanskrit texts. and often in complete isolation from how those texts are used in practice. And there is a set of, I would call them Protestant assumptions that have become embedded in the study of many of these texts. And there's actually a book about this by let's see, I'm Vishwa Adluri, I believe, and Joydeep Bagshi. Their names escape me for a second. But one of the things they've pointed to in their work is that when Indology really got going in the 19th century, this was also the same period that biblical criticism was building momentum in the Western Academy. And the assumption, I call the Protestant assumption, is that there is something like an original text with an original meaning that is accurate and correct, and everything else is mistaken, right? It's some sort of later accretion is the idea. And it's a Protestant assumption because if you look at the Catholic tradition, the ancient texts are always seen in light of how they've been interpreted later. And you have a whole list of commentators, and you aren't regarded as having really mastered the text until you've studied all the commentaries by all of, St. Thomas Aquinas and so on, going right up to the 20th century. But in the Protestant tradition, there's this idea that there is the original text. So you want to get back to the original text. And so anything that Hindus have done with, say, the Rig Veda or the Mahabharata since its initial composition is regarded as inauthentic, right? This is some later, add-on. And forget about the beliefs and practices of contemporary Hindus because, they're so far removed from the original text that, they can't possibly know. Right? So that has driven the study of Hinduism a great deal. One thing I think we also need to caution against, though, is painting the Western Academy also with too broad a brush. I see a big distinction between the way textual scholars look at Hindu traditions and the way anthropologists, especially contemporary anthropologists, look at Hinduism. Anthropology has a very checkered history, right? Because it was very tied up with the colonial project initially. But the American Anthropological Association actually has a code of ethics now, which really curtails the ability to talk about people in any sort of dehumanizing way. It's become a very empathetic discipline. And the anthropologists I know who study Hindu traditions, they've all embedded themselves in the tradition, often in villages, often, living alongside the common people, just in the same way that they do. And they get a really empathetic understanding, and that comes out in their work. Those aren't the controversial works, right? The controversial works are the ones where the texts are read in some way that, like you mentioned, that's very novel, and those are the ones that get a lot of attention and usually, negative attention. But there are a lot of really good, and there, I don't want to say there aren't good textual studies. There are, but what has happened is this sort of gap between what is seen as academic study and practice is very, very big. I think another thing too that happens very often is that if one does have a connection, a lived connection with the tradition, one's objectivity is seen as somehow suspect, that you're not going to be able to write objectively about the tradition if you're practicing it. But it's odd because the same thing could be said, as you've mentioned, about the studies of other religions, right? There are a lot of practicing Buddhists who do work on Buddhist philosophy, and I really don't see anyone objecting to that. So I would like to see the Hindu traditions treated just in the same way that we see other traditions treated. And I think it's happening increasingly, but all of this, political firestorm that's going on all of the time sometimes conceals what people are often actually doing in their study, right? And a lot of scholars, and in fact, I would put this in myself in this category. I sometimes kind of get pulled into these conversations, but I really would rather not. I mean, I would rather just do my work and share with people what I'm learning and what I've seen about these traditions, which to me, it's transformed my life in all kinds of positive ways. So I have a desire to have people see that. I want people to learn more about Sri Ramakrishna and Swami Vivekananda. I don't necessarily want them to. People can study whatever they want, but I'm not there to promote what you might call the negative side of things. And I think it's important, though, to understand when people in any tradition engage in abuses and go against the spirit of the tradition. But the problem very often is, as you say, if the person reporting on that is not sympathetic to the tradition, they're likely to ascribe whatever negative thing they're looking at to the tradition as a whole, rather than to say, well, this is these people here doing this thing with their justification, but that doesn't reflect, all of Hinduism by any means.
So that's a wonderful note and a positive note to end this conversation. We're running out of time. Thank you very much. I want to again encourage all readers and all viewers to read your book. It's a beautiful book, Hinduism in America, Convergence of Worlds, by Jeffery Long. I loved reading this book. I encourage you to read it. Thank you very much, Professor Long, for talking to me. And, I would like to continue this conversation in other formats as we both delve deeper into Hinduism. Thank you very much for your time.
Very kind of you. Thank you so much.